Shalom. Welcome. I'm Rabbi Scott with Beth Yeshua Messianic Synagogue in Fort Myers, Florida. We are reissuing the Revelation series that was taught by Rabbi Jim Pickens here at Beth Yeshua over the course of the last 2 years or so. We feel these messages are especially relevant in these tumultuous times, and we hope and pray that Adonai uses them to strengthen you and to encourage you. If you are currently a supporter of this ministry, we would like to say thank you. We appreciate your partnership with us as we all labor together in the work of the gospel of Yeshua in the kingdom here on earth. If you would like to support us, you will find a link below in the video description. Once again, we hope that this is a blessing to you. If you have any questions, you will find an email address. If you have any dialogue or discussion, you'll find an email address in the video description below. Please reach out to us. We'd love to hear from you. And now I will give you the Revelation series with Rabbi Jim Pickens. Shalom.
Let's do a little review to get us up to speed before we plow the new ground. In Revelation 4, we saw that John had been taken up into heaven in a vision. He sees 24 elders and 4 living beings who would be angelic beings. These were surrounding a throne on which someone was sitting who would be later identified as Adonai, God of heaven's armies, and this God of heaven's armies is later seen to have a scroll in his hand. The question goes out to everyone in the heavens, on earth, and under the earth, who is worthy to open the scroll, and it seemed apparent that there was no one worthy. John is really upset by this because his theology held that there was no one, or that there was one, that was worthy to break the scrolls. Then one of the 24 elders spoke to John and said, "The Lion of the tribe of Judah, the Root of David, has won the right to open the scroll, to break the seals." The scene goes on. The Lion of the tribe of Judah appears as a lamb that looks like it had been slaughtered. This is an idiom, looking like a lamb that looks as has been slaughtered. It's an idiom for one who has been resurrected. Then in verse 1 of chapter 6, John says, "I watched as the Lamb broke the first of the 7 seals. And the first of the 4 living beings said in a thundering voice," which was an indication that he spoke for God. He says in this thundering voice, "Go." Most translations say come, but the Complete Jewish Bible chooses to use go. This is the releasing of the horse and rider to do his thing. So let's pick this up then in Revelation 6, beginning in verse 1, do verses 1 and 2. "Next I watched as the Lamb broke the first of the 7 seals, and I heard one of the 4 living beings say in a thundering voice, 'Go.' I looked, and there in front of me was a white horse. Its rider had a bow, and it was given a crown, and he rode off as a conqueror to conquer." As we do each of these seals, I'm going to give you first how the dispensationalists, the pre-tribulationists, interpret this, then give you some other opinions, including my own, as to what this is saying to us. The pre-tribulationists, for instance, believe that the rapture of the church is going to take place before the tribulation process begins. That's how they got the title of being pre-tribbers. Test all things. This tribulation period is the 7-year period that most people believe begins when Israel signs a treaty guaranteeing their peace, and that the person they sign this treaty with will be revealed ultimately as the false or anti-Messiah. The position of the pre-tribulationists is that during this period the rapture has already occurred. The time in which these seals are opened would be in that time, and that the one who goes forth on this white horse conquering is the false Messiah. And there's a lot of people that hold to that theory. There is a substantial belief in this out there in the greater body of Messiah. That's from the pre-tribulationist view. But let's look at this from another point of view now. This opening of the seal is going to be a recurring theme. It is believed that the first 4 seals are a unit. They belong together, showing the self-defeating nature of sin and the judgment of God through the wrath of man. The next two seals after this unit of 4 would be seals 5 and 6 and would deal with things in heaven rather than things on earth. Then the last seal, the 7th, stands apart from the first 6 in that it ushers in the next series of visions, which are the trumpets or shofars. The next series of trumpets being the trumpets or shofars. This pattern of 4, then 2, then 1 is repeated with the trumpets or shofars. In this first vision, when the seal is broken, John says, "I looked, and there in front of me I saw." What John saw was a white horse. We saw some mention of horses and the colors of horses in our study of Zechariah, so let's go there for a minute. First scripture we want to look at is Zechariah 1:8. Zechariah 1:8. "It was night, and I saw there before me a man riding a russet-colored horse. He stood among the myrtle bushes in the valley, and behind him were other horses, russet, chestnut-colored, and white." Then it says in Zechariah 6:3, "The third chariot, white horses, and the fourth chariot, spotted gray horses." There's this concept of having a white horse or horses in both of these passages, much like here in Revelation 6:2, but there doesn't seem to be any relationship to a specific meaning of the white horses from passage to passage, including the one we're looking at here in Revelation 6:2. Occasionally we will find someone that is forcing a relationship between what is being said in Zechariah, but I don't see it. I just wanted us to be aware of this. Test all things. First thing that we have to note in Revelation 6:2 is that the horses are mentioned first. The horses are mentioned first, the rider is mentioned second. The normal way we see this sort of thing presented is, look, there's a rider on a white horse. Here, though, the horse is mentioned first and the rider second. Second thing we need to be aware of is the color of the horse relates to the rider. Consider that. The color of the horse relates to the rider. The color of the horse has something to do with the rider himself. Generally, the symbolism of a horse has to do with war, but the color white is associated with victory, which in effect is talking about a war. Seemingly, this indicates that this rider has victory in the coming war that's going to be looked at. The emphasis here is that it is in this war that he's riding off to be part of. God's victory comes through war rather than through peace seems to be the symbolism in this case. And then the attention turns to the rider who is specifically identified. But characteristics of the rider help identify him, even though he's not specifically identified. He held a bow, which was a symbol of war, is a symbol for war, which immediately reinforces the symbolism of war given to the horse. And again, the horse is a symbol of victory in war. Now we have the rider holding the bow, which is a symbol of war, and war, which would bring the victory to God instead of peace. Then the rider wears a crown. The crown here, the Greek is Stephanos. We've seen that word before. It's the crown of a victor. It's not a diadem, the crown of a ruler. It's the crown of the one who is victorious. The kind of crown was used before with the 24 elders. The gold crowns that they were casting towards the throne of Adonai, the God of heaven's army, were the Stephanos crowns. In Revelation 2:10, it talks about the Stephanos as a crown of the overcomer, where life is given as a crown. The ability to prevail in a war of the manner depicted in Revelation was what God caused the overcomer to do, and the symbolic crown was a Stephanos. Here are some other concepts or theories that people have developed about this first seal and this rider with a bow on the white horse. I'm going to give you about 4. There are more, but we need to finish this before Messiah returns. First thought we should be aware of is, some think that this is the Messiah himself on this white horse. This moves to the other end of the spectrum from those that think it might be the false Messiah. But a number of people believe that this is referring to Messiah. The connection that can be possible with this is Revelation chapter 19. There it is clearly Messiah that is riding on a white horse, as mentioned. Others believe that this is a false Messiah. We discuss the pre-tribulation people being of this thought. Others believe that this merely symbolizes the spirit of conquest, and finally there is a group that believe that this represents the victory of the gospel. The thought of who is on this white horse and what it represents is widespread. There's no real consensus. Thoughts all over the map. One interesting thought, though, is that this has a historical basis. This represents a Parthian king that won a victory over Romans in 62 Common Era. Parthians were known for their bowmanship. Their prowess with the bow as a weapon of war was well known. So let's now turn to Daniel, chapter 7 and verse 23. Daniel 7 and verse 23. This is what he said. The fourth animal will be the fourth kingdom on earth. It will be different from the other kingdoms. It will devour the earth, trample it down, and crush it. This would appear to support those that think the rider on the white horse is the false Messiah. I'm not sure that this completely makes their case, but they tie this with the rest of Revelation 6:2, where it says, the rider on the white horse rides off as a conqueror to conqueror. He rides off in conquest. So the rider represents war, the horse represents victory in war, the bow represents war. Apparently conquest is the only aim of this rider. The fact that he will accomplish this is a foregone conclusion because Scripture says he was given a victor's crown. As we look at this and other riders, we'll notice an essential likeness among all of the riders. Clearly they belong together. Because of this essential likeness, they clearly belong together. All deal with judgment. Keep that in mind. All deal with judgment. The beating down of earthly powers, the breaking up of earthly peace, the exhausting of earthly wealth, and the destruction of earthly life. So the first horseman, like of the rest of them, could be a woe, the first of the four woes. Denoting war is the first of four woes that we come to, and we have to think of the last century, the 20th century, particularly as we get into the second seal. The 20th century was dominated by war. And we're talking big wars here, World War I, World War II. What basically stopped man in his continuing conquest for world domination? Thermonuclear weapons. That ended the massive wars. The fear of destruction in reprisal for an attempted conquest. In the late 1800s, the internal combustion engine was developed. All kinds of high explosives were developed so that man could from that point on go all over the globe and kill each other. And again, the question is, what stopped that? And the fear of Hiro and Nagasaki is the answer. Yes, we had Korea, we had Vietnam, we had the Gulf War, but generally the big multi-nation wars of the first half of the last century ceased to exist. These were stopped by what is termed as MAD, M-A-D, mutually assured destruction. But now we're back on the edge again. Look at what might have happened between India and Pakistan just a few weeks ago when they were venting at each other. The big powers went to them and said, look at what you're on the brink of. Showed them if they went into a nuclear conflict, because both have the nuclear weapons, they have the bombs. How would this affect the rest of the world? And they were talking radiation in the United States as a possibility from all of that. Consider that now there are others that are very close to having nuclear weaponry and the means of delivering them. And some estimates say this could be in as little as 2 to 5 years. Those who have the sense of martyrdom being a cool thing are the ones now being close to developing nuclear weapons. And martyrdom is a good thing in their minds as long as the infidel is destroyed. I think this first horseman that they're talking about here is all about war, and I don't think it is the false Messiah. Scripture goes out of its way to show us that the false Messiah is not victorious, but that it's God and Messiah that are victorious. I think that this is a war being in place over peace as long as the last kingdom of man is in place and the lust for conquest is there. A chief tenet of Islam is that the world must be conquered for Islam no matter what cost. This is not a very politically correct to say, but so be it. So now let's look at the second seal. Revelation 6, 3 and 4. Then he broke the second seal, and I heard the second living being say, Go, and another horse went out, a red one, and its rider was given the power to take peace away from the earth and make people slaughter each other. He was given a great sword. Keep note of that great sword. Let's see what the dispensationalist pre-trib view of this would be. With the second horseman of the apocalypse, peace is removed from the earth. The opposite of peace is what we've been looking at all along, war. This is speaking of the period of peace and false security that existed before the tribulation, and it's now shattered during the tribulation. The false Messiah comes as a conqueror to conquer in his worldwide conquest, and the tribulation begins with a war. There are three major wars that are going to take place during this period of tribulation, and the second seal is the first being broken, is telling us this is the first of the three wars. The second war will be about in the middle, about 3.5 years in, and the third will be the Battle of Armageddon that occurs at the end. That position holds that the second seal is the opening of the first war that begins the tribulation period. So let's look at some other thoughts on the second seal. With the opening of the second seal, another of the four living beings gives the order to go to the second horseman. Not the same horse, just a different color. It makes it very clear another horse went out, a separate and distinct symbol. Where these horses are coming from is not mentioned to us. This horse is a fiery red, probably the symbolism of this description, and there are two thoughts on this. These would be bloodshed. Red would indicate bloodshed. But it also could relate sin to sin. So how do we comport red color with sin? Well, there's some scriptural support with this. Let's look in Isaiah chapter 1, verse 18, please. It says, Come now, says Adonai, let's talk this over together. Even if your sins are like scarlet, they will be white as snow. Even if they are red as crimson, they will be like wool. Note the tying of red and white together here, because our first horse was white. He's going to be involved in this war as well. And the second one is red, and he's also going to be involved in this war. Maybe the one that creates the war that the white horse rider has to be involved in. Some tie this fiery red color of the horse to sin via this passage. I'm not all sure that works well, but it's here. Here again, the rider isn't described in any physical terms, but is given power. And note that that power is not inherent in the rider himself. What power is he given? To take peace from the earth. This term, like in verse 2, is directed towards war and conquest. The power talks here of international and civil strife, perhaps international wars, or even in civil wars. Look at what's been going on over in Syria for the last 6 years. It's just been a gigantic ongoing civil war that people have been going down. Look at what's been going on in Afghanistan that we've been involved in. Some believe we're no longer talking about large political entities fighting one another like in the 2 world wars, but it may be more ethnic. It may be more a civil war type thing. The second thing is the power influences men to make men slay each other. This power that's loosed through this red horse and its rider influences men to make men slay each other. Complete Jewish Bible uses the term slaughter. Slaughter. The usual word for slaughter is not used here. That would simply mean to kill. That word that is usually... Here the word used indicates to butcher each other. A form of inhumanity, as if war could ever be humane. But this takes it to a really gross level. The first writer was given a crown. In the same sort of language, the second writer was given a large sword. Large sword, indicating that the war that sword's involved in is going to be huge, large. The bow was a characteristic of the first writer. It was his very nature. It says he had a bow. The sword is different. It's given to the writer. First writer had a bow when he showed up. Second writer is given a bow. We have to take note of these things. The sword represents the international strife and civil war, and this writer, interestingly, is not said to kill anyone. Nowhere in Scripture does it indicate that he personally kills anyone. Notice that. This isn't somebody who goes around slaughtering people. What he does is take peace away. He takes peace away. This causes men to slaughter each other as the lack of peace increases. The judgment is in the form of man's inhumanity against man. What may be involved here is that this woe takes away any false peace that the earth might have thought they had. Some believe that a period of peace and false security that will be in place, Israel's going to sign this 7-year contract that is going to be broken 3.5 years in. They're going to believe that there's going to be this sense of false peace. We're not going to have any problems until all of a sudden it explodes in their faces. Some believe that a period of peace and false security is going to be shattered here. And this is the first of the coming 3 major wars. It's a picture, if we're paying attention, at the beginning of the tribulation period that's indicating what's going to happen midway through this tribulation period, if you will. This is the first of the 3 major wars in the dispensational view. Now there's also this thought. We're facing internationally something that we've never faced before. We're now facing internationally something that we've never faced before. And all of the commentaries written to this point show that they have never guessed it. Commentaries that were written back when I was a youngster. With regard to the terrorism threat that we have in the world today, how much money has the United States appropriated now for the potential that this war could come? Well, it's billions and billions if you really look at it and investigate. We hear warnings all the time. The government's trying to recruit millions of American citizens to be domestic spies. I don't know if you've heard any of those, but I've picked up on those. American citizens spying on other Americans. This is an interesting thought, and I'm not going to put myself on a limb by saying that we're here now, but I believe we are in events that are leading up to this. When this happens really is too early to tell, but this second writer is going to take peace from the earth, and he's going to do it in a multitude of ways. What will happen if there's another major terrorist event against the U.S. homeland? What will be the repercussions and fallout if the U.S. moves against Iraq, or Iran, or Syria? What happens when those that are interfacing with us, such as mailmen, repairmen, and others, begin to think out people over what they think they see, or maybe who they don't like? See, we're looking ahead to really at human bombs that are going to go off against us. Won't be explosives, but they're going to cause casualties. We also potentially could have chemical and biological warfare in this country as people that are coming in now, particularly through our southern border, but also out of Canada, that goal is to overthrow the government that we have in this country. You know, eventually if they get their hands on weapons, they're going to use them. They could even smuggle nuclear weapons into this country. And I believe it'll come to a point that it is only God and Messiah that we're going to be able to depend on. That's what all this is really giving us information to lead up and point to. It's only God and Messiah that we can depend on. And notice, unlike the first writer, if you consider the first writer picturing political entities like nations fighting each other, here there's no political entity of that type. There's no definable political entity. The turmoil is caused by the taking away of peace well beyond dealing with territorial borders. We went into Afghanistan and knocked that regime down, but that didn't knock out the problem. It's still going on. See, this is beyond geopolitical borders. The problem still exists really throughout the whole world. I think it's apparently at some level in every country. So there's a thought based on the signs of our times. We're to watch the signs of our times to see how they correspond with Scripture. But let's see where it goes before we say this is it, that we're here already. Let's just say that these passages make more sense now than they did 25 years ago. Let's look at the third seal, Revelation 6, 5 and 6, please. When he broke the third seal, I heard the third living being say, "Go." And I looked, and there in front of me was a black horse. Its rider held in his hand a pair of scales. Then I heard what sounded like a voice from among the four living beings say, 2 pounds of wheat for a day's wages, 6 pounds of barley for the same price, but don't damage the oil or the wine. That verse 6 we're really going to look at. The Lamb opens the third seal, and again in rotation, the third living being before the throne calls out, "Go." If you remember from chapter 4 when we looked at that, first of these living beings had a face like a lion, the second like an ox, the third like a man, and the fourth one had a face like an eagle. The third one, the one with a face like a man, is called out, "Go," and the horse that appears is black. Now, normally the symbolism of black would be mourning or grief. Here it is associated with famine. Here it is associated with famine. And the rider here is described as holding a pair of scales in his hand. Literally, the Greek used here would be directly translated as a balance beam. A balance beam. What John saw was a balance beam. And the third living being calls the black horse, and a voice in verse 6 makes an audible statement. This is not the third living being, but another voice. In this verse 6, it makes an audible statement. What sounded like a voice from among the four living beings, but the source isn't identified in the statement, gives information on the economic condition of the earth at the time that the seals will be broken. And that is 2 pounds of wheat for a day's wages, 6 pounds of barley for the same price, but don't damage the oil or the wine. Most translations will have quarts here for the measure. Complete Jewish Bible uses a form of measure of pounds, just a different form of measure. The actual amount given for wheat, where it says 2 pounds, is really about 1.92, just a little something of detail that you can throw away. It's indicating what it would take to sustain one man for one day. That's what the money that you would have would sustain, that you would be able to buy if you bought wheat, enough to feed one person. This indicates that a family unit would starve if the single unit income was spent on wheat. Barley, considerably cheaper, would be available at roughly a 3-to-1 ratio over wheat. Barley, if it were available, would sustain a family of 3. It's interesting in some of these commentaries, people have tried to figure all of this out in strange ways. And they went to an inflation factor in most cases of somewhere between 8 and 16 as to what changes in our money's ability to support us. Let's round that off to 10, because 10 is an easy number to deal with. If it's the factor is 10, then $1 that we have today would end up being only worth 10 cents in value. If you make $500 a week today, when this goes into play, it would now be worth $50 to buy food with when this sets in. 10-to-1 inflation rate. Now, this is hypothetical, but it points to a condition of barley being the sustainable product for our existence. Now, this is coming at the time the seals is broken. It's telling us that all the resources that the common working people can generate are consumed just to keep away from starvation. That's what this is in essence telling us. Tell us that there's a great dearth, but not absolute famine. What is depicted here is a worldwide famine condition as a result of this war and civil and international strife portrayed in this second horse. And the last phrase says, do not damage the oil or the wine. Complete Jewish Bible uses damage. The actual Greek word is hurt. It's an interesting word because the Greek word hurt is made up of a prefix, a negative prefix attached to the word justice. In other words, what's translated hurt up here, don't damage the oil or the wine, is in effect telling us that there's no justice in this phrase that's being given to us about what we're going to have to deal with as common folks, but yet what the wealthy are going to be able to deal with. In effect, no justice. Translated to the English word hurt or damage. This portion of the verse has been translated in various ways, that while the necessities of life are scarce, is the main thing, not so the non-necessities. It's going to be hard to find enough barley to eat, but the oil and the wine, they'll be plentiful. You just don't have any money to buy them. That is, the luxuries of life are going to be plentiful. They will be in abundance. Another thought is that there are two-class system that this is talking about. There's going to be the very rich and the very poor. Perhaps no middle class at all. And the rich aren't worried about anything, and the working class is near starvation. Regular use of oil and wine has always been associated with affluence. The Greek indicates no justice when it comes to oil and wine. Thirdly, some believe that the oil and wine could be symbols for medicinal purposes. We get all kinds of thoughts filter in here. Remember the Good Samaritan? He used oil and wine to treat the injuries of the traveler he found on the road up to Jerusalem, lying alongside that road. Also, this third horseman with the scales becomes, well, let me put it differently. This third horseman with scales measures the economic structure of the world at that time. He's giving us a measure of the economic structure of the world at that time. The thought is that in times of scarcity, food is weighed. It is not given out by volume. It is weighed. In other words, rationed. Notice how the Complete Jewish Bible translates this. It translates it in weight measure. 2 pounds of wheat, 6 pounds of barley. The balance beam brings one to this kind of conclusion. Food's going to be rationed, weighed out at the time. There's an interesting reference in regard to the scarcity of food when it's weighed. Leviticus 26:26, please. This is God speaking. He says, I will cut off your supply of bread so that 10 women will bake your bread in one oven and dole out your bread by weight, and you will eat but not be satisfied. I want us to think about this now. I want us to really think about this. I'll cut off your supply of bread so that 10 women will bake your bread in one oven. Now, if you've got 10 women who are baking bread, and they're all baking a loaf of bread, they're going to need 10 ovens. That's what this is indicating. But you've got 10 women whose goal is to bake bread, but there's only one oven. And so you're only going to get one loaf. It's going to have to be divided among all of these 10 families. And you will eat, but not be satisfied. The Lamb breaks the fourth seal. The fourth living being makes the call that sends out the fourth horse. This horse sent out at this time is going to be pallid. Revelation 6, 7, 8. When he broke the fourth seal, I heard the voice of the fourth living being say, "Go." And I looked, and there in front of me was a pallid, sickly, red-looking horse. Its rider's name was Death, and Sheol followed behind him. They were given authority to kill 1/4 of the world by war, by famine, by plagues, and with the wild animals of the earth. See, all of those listed there at the end of that last sentence are going to be involved in the killing off of 1/4 of the world population. War, famine, plagues, and the wild animals of the earth. This horse sent out this time is pallid, pale green, sickly looking. That's what's interesting is the Greek word used here is colores, C-O-L-O-R-E-S in the English, a word from which we get the English word chlorine. Chlores means yellowish green, and if you look at chlorine, it's kind of a yellowish green. Actually, if you look at a rainbow someday, if you can see one that's large enough and bright enough between the blue and the yellow, you'll find this shade of yellow-green is actually available in a rainbow. An unusual color for a horse, wouldn't you say? The color is symbolic of the color of a corpse in the very early stages of decomposition, because what this is pointing to is death. It's pointing to 1/4 of the world being taken out. Yellowish green, and the other riders had a sign to identify him. The first rider had a bow. The second rider had a sword. The third rider had a scales. And this rider here, though, is named Death and needs no sign to identify himself. There's no indicator as to who this rider is, only his name. Death occurs through pestilence. The Greek word is death, but pestilence could be substituted. Then it says that Sheol followed the rider named Death. Most English translators will use the word Hades. A few will use hell instead of Sheol. Closely following behind Sheol is death. Sheol is a place of departed spirits. Death and Sheol are personified in this verse. They were personified in Revelation 1:17, middle of 17 through 18, please. He placed his right hand upon me and said, "Don't be afraid." This is John speaking of Yeshua. Yeshua placed his right hand upon me, John, and said, "Don't be afraid. I am the first and the last." Verse 18, the living one. I was dead, but look, I am alive forever and ever. I, that is Yeshua, hold the keys to death and Sheol. Well, that's probably as neat a thing as we can read out of this whole thing. If he's in charge of it, then he's able to preserve us. But let's go take this to Revelation 20, verse 13. The sea gave up the dead in it, and death and Sheol gave up the dead in them, and they were judged, each according to what he had done. Now remember Revelation 20, we're getting down to the end and the final of everything that's going on.
The sea gave up the dead in it, and death and Sheol gave up the dead in them. And they were judged, each according to what he had done. Then death and Sheol were hurled into the lake of fire. This is the second death, the lake of fire. Now, is Hades not hell? Why are we throwing hell into the lake of fire? Isn't the lake of fire hell? You see, this requires a whole greater renewal of definition, which hopefully we can get into before we get through the end of this study, if you will. Death and Sheol are personified. There's one horse, a pallid, sickly green horse, like the color of a corpse, but there are two figures. It is clear from the text that Sheol, Hades, is not riding the same horse with death, and that Sheol is not riding another horse. There's only one horse. Sheol just follows death. Remember, the rider death, or we might say pestilence, is the cause of all kinds of destroying agents. The personified death here is the cause of all destroying agents, and we again see that power was given, the authority was given. Revelation 6:8, they were given authority to kill 1/4 of the world. By war, by famine, by plagues, and with the wild animals of the earth. So we're seeing that death and Sheol are under control of the sovereign God, i.e. in the form of Messiah. In Revelation 1:18 we looked at earlier, Yeshua said that death and Sheol have been given to me. They're under his control of the risen Messiah. Here death and Sheol have only the power that he gives them. But the power that he gives them here is awe-inspiring. 1/4 of the world's population is slain in the ways mentioned. What's the world's population right now? Roughly 7.7 billion, give or take. So what we're talking about is somewhere in the neighborhood of 1.8 billion people being killed at this time. And that's why people don't like to study Revelation in depth. They don't want to hear stuff like this. 1/4 of the earth's population. First of all, by sword. And the word used here for sword is the broadsword, as used by the barbarian people. The sword carried by this second rider. It's also used in two other places. First in Genesis, this is interesting, Genesis 3:24, please. So he drove the man out. This is Adam being driven out by the Holy Spirit, by probably pre-incarnate Yeshua. So he drove the man out, and he placed at the east of the Garden of Eden the cherubim and the flaming sword which turned in every direction to guard the way to the tree of life. Hebrew here, when translated into Greek, becomes the same word that's used in Revelation 6:4. Also, we need to look at Luke 2:33. Yeshua's father and mother were marveling at the things that Shimon was saying about him. Understand that they've taken Yeshua on the 8th day of his life from birth to the temple to be circumcised. And one of those in the temple that was a watchman on the wall, looking for the coming Messiah, that was his assigned position, sees him and identifies him. And Shimon were saying things to Joseph and Mary. And they were marveling at the things he was saying to them. And Shimon, Simon, blessed them and said to the child's mother, Mary, this child will cause many in Israel to fall and to rise. He will become a sign whom people will speak against, like the whole nation. Moreover, a sword will pierce your own heart too. All this will happen in order to reveal many people's inmost thoughts. So, this was at the temple, again, when Yeshua's Brit Milah, circumcision, and as part of the blessing given by Simon, one of God's watchmen. He would be in the Temple Mount, because the Temple Mount was really one of the walls of Jerusalem. One of the eastern walls of Jerusalem was the eastern wall of the Temple Mount. And he was looking for the coming Messiah. The broad sword will pierce your own heart too, it says. The sword of the barbarian people. That's interesting. The slaughter spoken of in Revelation 6:4 could speak of massive civil slaughter, or perhaps other kind of war. Then there's famine, death by starvation, pestilence or plagues. We have the AIDS thing that's going on now, with probably 14,000 people a day being infected by the AIDS virus. Can you imagine that, 14,000 people a day being infected by the AIDS virus? But there are other things that are breaking out. For instance, I don't know if any of you have paid any attention to this, but measles outbreak is going on around the world, and people think, well, measles, some kids get the measles, and that's a bad thing. But understand that there have been 1,200 kids contract measles on the island of Madagascar alone in the past 7 months. The number of measles cases reported worldwide in the first 3 months of 2019 has tripled compared to the same time last year, according to the World Health Organization. They said that provisional data indicated a clear trend that all regions of the world are seeing measles outbreaks. Africa has witnessed the worst dramatic rise, up to 700%. The agent said the actual numbers may be far greater since only 1 in 10 cases globally are reported. So you can just let your imaginations go places with that. The largest measles outbreak in Madagascar's history has struck the island country with over 115,000 documented cases, except they're saying probably only 1 in 10 gets documented. Well, that's 1,150,000 cases potentially on Madagascar. I'm not going to bear you any further into that. Anyhow, I believe that the plagues I speak of are going to become more virulent even than AIDS and measles. And then finally it says wild animals. Some people think that food will be so scarce that the wild animals will attack man as a food source. Generally, we don't care about wild animals today. We live in cities. Wild animals don't bother us. And we have firearms, right? But the question is, when will men have firearms that could prevent this at the very end of the age when the government's cracking down on everybody? But it says here that wild animals will be involved in this killing off of the quarter of the world's population. Think about this as well. There is an element of the world elite today who believe that the only way to preserve the earth is through population control. They will actually be encouraged by 1/4 of the world's population being killed off. Their minds, it will ultimately help the Mother Earth heal itself. They will do nothing to prevent any of this. Some will even encourage this killing off of these people. One more stop. Let's go to Ezekiel 14:21. Here's what Adonai Elohim says. Even if I inflict my 4 dreadful judgments on Jerusalem, sword, famine, wild animals, and plagues, to eliminate both its humans and its animals, there will still be left a remnant in it to be brought out. Because it's not going to affect you and me and the rest of the true believers around the world. So it appears that the days that Jerusalem faced, a couple of examples that you can use were back in 586 BC and again in 70 Common Era, might give us some insight as to what it may be like worldwide in the days of the seals being broken. This 4th horseman of the apocalypse, in my mind, represents what man does to man. What man is going to perpetrate against himself. We have to stop here. We'll start in with the 5th seal with 2 weeks. There's a lot in the 5th seal.